All right, Alexander, we have to talk about Cuba, protests on the streets in Cuba. And okay, the narrative in the mainstream media is that people are on the streets protesting against the government. We've seen the videos, we've seen the photos, they've had interviews of these protesters. Alexander, what do you think is the reasoning for the protests out on the street? Obviously, many U.S. senators, most notably Marco Rubio, has come out, of course, in favor of the protests, and the United States is, of course, in favor of the protests. The Cuban government has cracked down, tried to crack down, has cracked down on the protesters. But what do you think is driving these protests? Is it as simple as people are just sick of communism? Is it the coup? I've heard that it's the coup and many of the things related to the coup and the way the government's handled the coup, shortages. What do you think is driving these protests out on the streets in Cuba, which is very rare to see?
Yeah, it is rare to see. I mean, I should say it's not unprecedented, but it hasn't happened for a long time. I mean, there have been other times when there have been protests in Cuba, but the usual mechanism the Cuban government has used in the past is to let these people, whoever's protesting, emigrate to the United States, and that's become more difficult recently. So there are protests in Cuba, but the Cuban government tends to take a pretty hard line towards protests. Now, there are many reasons behind these protests. Firstly, I think it's important to stress that this is a very difficult time for Cuba. Economically, the Cuban economy has been suffering badly as a result of the very tough sanctions that were brought back by the Trump administration. And of course, it's also been very badly affected by the collapse in the tourist industry, which is something that many countries around the world have been experiencing. But tourism became, in the 1990s and 2000s, a major tourist earner for Cuba, and that's completely dried up. And that's been a major problem for the government. It's also become a major problem for the service industry in Cuba. Many people in Cuba who work privately, there is limited private enterprise being allowed in Cuba. They haven't been able to make money as they once could, and they haven't been able to get possession of foreign currency as they once could, and that's made life much harder for many, many people. Then on top of that, of course, the government itself has done the same thing that governments around the world have done in response to the pandemic, which is they've imposed lockdowns. Now, Cuba has worked hard to create its own medications. Again, I'm using very careful language because in spite of all the things that we're told about, that you can say things, I'm still wary about using words. But when I talk about medications, I mean the medications that, we've been using around the world. So Cuba worked to try and create its own instead of perhaps more wisely trying to import some from its friends, China and Russia. It decided to do it all itself. So it delayed any program, and it worked through very tough lockdowns. And that's, of course, done even more damage to the economy, and it created even more restrictions. So you've got those objective factors which were, to some extent, beyond Cuba's control. But there are other things, and one has to say this. I mean, this government now, the Cuban communist system, has been in existence continuously ever since 1959. And for the last 30 years, Cuba's economy has been stagnating when its former aid donor, the Soviet Union, disappeared from the scene and no longer provided aid. And in the 1990s, it went through an economic crisis, and it's recovered up to a certain point. But it's never achieved any kind of takeoff. And you get more and more young people in Cuba, and this is unrelated to what is going on in the United States and to anything that the United States is doing. You get more and more young people who are becoming intensely frustrated. They're frustrated by the lack of economic opportunities within Cuba itself, the hardships of everyday life, which the pandemic restrictions have intensified, and of course, and I'm going to say this, the lack of political freedom in the country. And that's a major fact. I mean, people always, just, deny this, but Cuba is an educated country, and young people, want to be able to say what they want to say. They want to be able to live freely their lives, and they are very frustrated that they are not in a position to do that, and that they're not able directly to hold their government to account. Now, I know some people deny all this and challenge it, but that is the reality. And there is another factor, and it is a very important factor, and it is, I suspect, the single major reason why we've seen protests now. And that is that we are in Cuba at the moment through a period of political transition. Fidel Castro died some years ago. His brother Raul Castro took over. Then Raul Castro recently retired. So for the first time since the 1950s, Cuba is not led by a Castro. And that is a major factor. It's unsettling. And it means that the people who've taken over simply lack the authority and the legitimacy which indisputably the Castro brothers did acquire. And at the same time as this political transition is going on, the Cuban government is trying to carry out a very, very substantial economic reform. So it's privatizing large sectors of the economy. It's going to try and limit the economy to state control of the economy to a small number of enterprises. It's privatizing much of the economy. It's also carrying out a major monetary reform, which is going to hit people's living standards very hard. It's going to devalue the Cuban peso, abolish this dual system where you have the ordinary peso, which circulates in the country, and a special care peso, which is going to be used in certain special shops. And of course, there's also, however, going to continue to be foreign currency shops, which only tourists and certain people with access to hard currency are going to be used. So you've got all of these things happening at the same time, and it's perhaps unsurprising that there are protests. Now, of course, and inevitably, it is true that there are people in the United States who want to see change in Cuba and who are undoubtedly trying to facilitate the change. Some of these people are part of the Cuban community in the United States who take an interest in what goes on in their country and who are very opposed to the government there. And I would say, you can argue about, these people, but they have an interest. They have a national interest in what goes on in what used to be their own country. And of course, you have the neocons in the United States who still see Cuba as another country whose government they want to throw. And there's the regime change lobby. So all of these things have come together and they've created this situation now. So it's unsurprising that there are protests. I did wonder when I heard about these economic reform plans, which happened at the same time as Raul Castro was retiring, whether there might be some trouble. And sure enough, there was. So it's all of these things coming together, but I think it's the fact that Cuba has suffered a lot of hardship and is now going through a period of transition, which have brought all of these things together and have been the match, the light that set the fire blazing.
Yeah, usually during times of such transition, especially something like what Cuba's trying to pull off, you really do need skilled leadership. And so let's get to that. Let me read you from the BBC real quick, where they do talk about President Miguel Diaz-Canel. And the BBC says that he gave a 4-hour-long televised address where Canel slammed protesters as, and I quote, counter-revolutionaries, while his foreign minister alleged the demonstrations had been financed and instigated by the United States. He also labeled those protesting as, and I quote, mercenaries. And the BBC says this, but those who took to the streets said they were angry about the collapse of the economy, food and medicine shortages, price hikes, and the government's handling of the coup. Once again, Alexander, we see the coup, but we also see these narratives that are playing all around the world, which is price hikes, inflation, standard of living that's just, plummeting and going down. more money going to these few elites, and the rest of the people are just kind of left, wondering what the hell do we do? And then you couple that with lockdowns and restrictions, and you get these types of situations. Of course, Cuba gets even more complicated because, like you say, they're going through all these reforms. They're trying to do these reforms. They have the neocons there as well. I'm sure that China and Russia are also looking at Cuba and saying, well, where do we fit into this? And I want you to address that as well. But I talked about leadership. Does the president have the leadership and skill to pull this off? Because I don't know if he does. I don't feel confident that he does. And usually, if he can't pull this off, then we're going to see an interesting future for Cuba in the short term. Many things are going to happen. Many changes are going to happen in Cuba. And we're going to have to keep an eye out for that, because I just don't know if this president is able to do the things that you said and to still keep everything in order.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I don't know either. And to be straightforward about it, he's an unknown, to me at least, an unknown force, an unknown factor. I can't say whether, he's got the skill to pull it off. I'm going to make a few generalizations about how to handle these things. The first is that if you are going to be a leader in this kind of situation, you need to have very strong nerves. You need to be prepared to take a tough approach. Now, what I mean by a tough approach is the first thing you need to do is you need to be very careful how you handle the protests themselves. Unleashing the riot police, rounding up people, beating them up, trying to scare them in that kind of way may work in a few countries where the government is completely in control and where they are able to block out the media and where the armed forces can be completely relied upon. But more generally than not, it fails. It just inflames the situation. It means, for example, that if it's young people and they get beaten up by the riot police, their parents become angry and then their friends become involved. And then the whole thing begins to snowball and the whole thing slips out of control. Now, I noticed that in general, the riot police and the security forces in Cuba seemed to understand that, and the authorities seemed to understand that, and they didn't escalate. They allowed the protests to happen. They let the protests run their course. They did arrest a few people. They did use pepper spray in a few places, but generally we didn't see the kind of scenes, for example, that we saw in Belarus last year, where partly it was Lukashenko's own security forces that actually made the protests much bigger than they might otherwise have been. At least that was my own opinion. So in that respect, the government and the new president seem to be dealing with the situation in an intelligent way. The second thing is, I understand that he did go out onto the streets himself and meet and talk to some people who were protesting. And even though there was heckling and that sort of thing, but it's always important in this situation that the leader is visible, that he makes himself accessible, and he seems to have learned how to do that. And he did do that. Again, if you go back to Belarus, you remember how Lukashenko flew into a factory and met the workers there, and he was heckled to some extent, but eventually that did impress them, and it gave them the sense that he was there to stay, and it played a big role in apparently calming the protests. So he did do that. On the other hand, talking to people, haranguing them for 4 hours, it seems to me, is wildly excessive. Now, of course, Fidel Castro used to do that. He used to talk to the Cuban people for 4 or 5 hours, and I don't know to what extent they used to listen, but they used to take it from Castro because, well, he was Fidel Castro. But to what extent they're going to take it from this man to be harangued from 4 hours, most people, I think, would switch off. Most people, I think, would be exasperated by it. A lot of people would be, I think, annoyed. So I wonder whether that was a good idea. Having said that, again, at least he's been open about what happened. Again, another mistake that regimes make, when they face this kind of thing is that they try to pretend that life is going on as normal, that no protests took place, that everything is well, that, and that, of course, gives people a sense that, the government is completely out of touch. It doesn't know what it's doing. It's no longer in control, and that the leaders have lost all sense of reality. So he did acknowledge, for example, that there is a real economic crisis. He did talk about that. He discussed its causes. So that might be a good sign. But as I said, haranguing people for 4 hours is never a good idea. The one thing he did do, though, which, again, I think people in the United States do need to be aware of, is, of course, he did make use of the fact that people like Marco Rubio have talked about the protesters. And he is also, again, trying to unite Cuba behind himself by saying, well, these protests are orchestrated by an outside power, which is the United States, which has been the country that has created many of these problems for us by imposing this embargo. So can I just say again to those in the United States who do want to see change in Cuba, period of silence from you would be welcome for Cuba too. If you want to see change there, all you're doing by coming out and supporting people in Cuba in the way that you are is you're simply giving the government a narrative they can play with in order to unite support behind them. My guess is that because this government has been around for a very long time, because the security forces look pretty solid, because the president, unknown quantity though he is, seems to be making some of the right moves, I think the government will probably see these protests through, in the sense that they didn't seem to be enormous. I mean, one shouldn't underestimate their size, and protesting in Cuba is always a tricky thing. But at least, he handled them sufficiently well in order to buy himself time. But it's nonetheless the case that Cuba is in for tricky times. This is only the beginning. There's very likely going to be more protests, and he's got to hold his nerve, see through these economic changes that he's doing. At the same time, as I said, be very, very careful not to overreact to protests, to acknowledge what's going on, to talk to people, and at the same time, perhaps be firm on those things that are important to the survival of his government. If he does that, I think he'll carry this through. But, we'll see. And he's an untested figure, and we simply don't know.
China and Russia, how are they looking at this?
Right.
Are they getting involved,
Right.
or are they just going to watch from the sidelines?
They're watching from the sidelines, and here I think it's an important thing to say, because the Chinese and the Russians, especially more the Russians, who, by the way, the Russians have a genuine affection for the country. They were there for a very long time during the Soviet period, and Russians who went there liked it very much, and it was a nice place to go on holiday and all that. And lots of Russians, in other times when there isn't a pandemic, go to Cuba, and they are now an increasingly important part of tourist revenue in Cuba. The Russians and the Chinese went to Cuba, and they've spoken at various times about reopening economic links in Cuba. But they've also looked at the condition of the economy and at the structure of the economy, which continued very much once it was under the control of the Castros, to follow a Soviet economic model. And they told the Cubans straightforward, I'm shortening what is a long discussion. What they said to the Cubans is, this isn't going to work. If you expect us to bail you out, you have to carry out very fundamental economic reforms, because the kind of economic structure that you're operating is out of date, it's obsolete, it doesn't work, it's failed, and we're simply not going to invest in failure. So it was partly the fact that Cuba needs help from countries like China and Russia, which has pushed it towards carrying out these economic reforms that I was talking about. And bear in mind, getting rid of Castro, that's perhaps putting it too strongly, Raul Castro's retirement was probably necessary for these reforms to be carried out, because nobody really, I think, could believe that a Castro would ever carry out the kind of reforms that we're talking about. So if they're able to navigate through this transition, then I think you will see more economic aid from China and Russia. And certainly the Chinese and the Russians do not want to see regime change in Cuba. They don't want to see the government in Cuba fall. They will do nothing to prevent it happening, because realistically they can't. I mean, they can't deploy troops to Cuba at this time. I mean, that's out of the question. They might provide some degree of economic help in order to help smooth the transition, but they will only do that, I think, if they are confident that the transition will take place, because otherwise I think they will feel that they're simply throwing their money away. The Soviet Union, in its day, was prepared to do that. It was prepared to pour money into a country like Cuba, regardless of any economic losses to itself. China, and especially Russia, have made it absolutely clear that that's no longer going to happen anymore.
Okay, so that's why my next question is, how important is Cuba on a geopolitical level at this moment in time to China, to a lesser degree China, to more of a degree with Russia, given the history that exists, and to the United States? I mean, realistically, how important is Cuba on a geopolitical level?
No, I mean, it's not important in any sense of the way that it was during the Cold War. In the Cold War, it was the Soviet Union's advanced base in the Americas. There were Soviet troops there. There was, if you remember back in the 60s, as we all know, an attempt by the Soviets to put nuclear missiles there. They had a massive radar station. They had a massive spy base. Soviet warships used to, go to Cuba on regular basis and patrol the Gulf of Mexico. I mean, none of that is going on, and none of that is going to happen realistically anytime soon. The Russians do have a very strong sentimental attachment to Cuba, but it's not going to be enough by itself to make them change their policy. The Chinese never had that kind of connection with Cuba that the Russians did, and they don't feel about Cuba, I think, to the same extent that the Russians do. It will be unnerving to the Chinese if a communist government falls, because China is a communist government. So they won't want to see that happen, but they don't have that sense of involvement in Cuba that the Russians still do. So that's a fundamental point to understand, and it does inform their decisions. So it doesn't have that kind of geopolitical importance now. I don't think in reality it has that kind of geopolitical importance for the United States either. But of course, it's an emotional matter for the US, because Cuba is very close to the US. It's far and away the biggest country in the Caribbean. And I think it is unnerving for the US still that this country so close to themselves, this giant amongst Caribbean states, remains hostile and inaccessible to them. So in that respect, it is more important to the US than it is to China and Russia at the moment. However, that's the situation now. If things change, if the Cuban government is successful in carrying out these reforms, if it remains in power, if it stabilizes, then of course the calculus on the part of the Russians and the Chinese may start to change. We might start to see a major, especially a Russian re-engagement with Cuba. I'm not saying it's a certainty, but it's a possibility. The Russians at one time were saying that they were going to try and use Cuba as the regional headquarters for their companies, to try and export to South America. There was some talk about that a couple of years ago. They didn't do that for the reasons that I said. But it's possible that Cuba might at that point start to become more important to them again. But at the moment, it's not very important at all. And there's a sentimental feeling on the part of Russia. There's, as I said, some concern about the potential fall of a communist government on the part of China. They will be watching and waiting to see what happens, but ultimately it doesn't have the geopolitical importance to them that it once did.
All right. One more question, real quick question. Obama's foreign policy towards Cuba was one way. Trump took a different approach. Biden hasn't really said anything. That's to be expected. Which one do you think is influencing Cuba at this moment? Which one do you think has brought Cuba to where it is? Was it Trump's policy? Did that have his reversal of Obama's policy? Did that play a role, or do you think that didn't play much of a role?
I think it played a huge role because, of course, what happened when Obama, I mean, he didn't lift all the sanctions, but he established an embassy and he lifted some of the sanctions, and it meant that Cubans in the United States were able to travel to the island and send remittances there, which is an important currency stream, an important currency stream for the Cuban government, for the Cuban economy. And of course, Americans were able to travel to Cuba much more than they once could. All of that helped the economy considerably. And then Donald Trump comes along and he reverses all of that and makes the sanctions on Cuba even tighter than they had previously been. And the result is, in part, the crisis that we are seeing in Cuba now. I think Trump's actions had a decisive impact on Cuba and should not be underestimated. And of course, from his point of view, protests in Cuba are exactly what he wanted. And I would add that it also had a major political effect because it consolidated support for him amongst Latino Americans and in Florida especially. So from Trump's point of view, it was a successful policy. Whether it succeeds in the long term in actually changing the government in Cuba, that we will have to see. But in the short and medium term, it's had a decisive impact on what has happened in Cuba itself. And it's fascinating that the Democrats are terrified of reversing it because they know perfectly well that if they did, then their chances of ever winning back those Latino voters who they lost, the Spanish-American voters in the elections, are basically gone. So it looks as if the policy will remain as is.
Yeah, I'm just trying to figure out which one's a better approach in trying to open up Cuba, to make Cuba more free, for lack of a better word. Was Obama's approach the right way, or was Trump's the right way? Because we say on our programs many times how sanctions, and they just simply do not work. They bring more suffering than good. And we're in the early stages of what's unfolding in Cuba, so we just don't know what the future holds. Like you said, if these protests continue, if the government gets a handle on them, we don't know yet. We'll see. We'll find out. But I'm just trying to figure out which approach will be a better approach for Cuba in order to bring the country more up to date from an economic perspective, as you said, or as the Russians may have told Cuba.
I know. Now, it depends very much. We can't say at the moment, but it depends very much what happens over the course of the next year. And I think this year is going to be absolutely crucial. If the government survives, then I think there's a reasonable case for saying that if you're specifically interested in Cuba itself, then probably there was some more merit to Obama's approach, in the sense that Obama's approach perhaps was to try to draw Cuba into the US orbit. I would add, though, that its short-term effect, and it's essential to say this, was that it strengthened the Cuban government. The Cuban government came out better from that deal with Obama than it would otherwise have been. It got sanctions lifted. It got its legitimacy accepted by the United States. The United States opened diplomatic relations with it. It recognized it as the true government of Cuba. So it strengthened the government in the short term. In the very long term, the idea is it might have drawn Cuba into the orbit of the United States, possibly. Who knows? But that was the justification. Trump's plan, by contrast, and let's be straightforward about this, is to asphyxiate the government to the point where it falls. At the moment, it hasn't fallen. There are protests, but it seems to be in control. If the protests grow and if the government loses control and it does fall, then Trump's approach will be vindicated. If, on the other hand, the government survives, then it could, in the longer term, also again emerge stronger, because it will be able to establish closer links with China and Russia, and maybe the economy itself will begin to turn round. So it's too early to say, but this year, perhaps even the next few weeks, but certainly this year, I think, will give us a clear picture of which approach is the right one.
All right. Very interesting stuff going on in Cuba. We will keep
Absolutely.
our eyes on it. Guys, go to our locals page. Go to the Duran shop. 10% off. Use the code REALNEWS. And, of course, Odyssey, BitChute, Rumble, Super U. Check out Super U, the free speech video platform. And, of course, once again, our locals community. That's it. Take care.